All right. Hey, welcome everybody.
Brian, do you want to listen to this?
Dr. Hunter Peterson here and Ty Rockwell, our massage therapist at Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts. This is the monthly open forum, and I get the privilege of doing one of these every 4 months alongside our other doctors rotating every month to discuss with our community a whole variety of health topics. And so today we have come with the exciting topic of electricity and health. And we're going to dive into that, into
bigger.
The history of that, I guess, giving you an outline, the story about electricity's relationship to human health, both from the evolution of that story as pertains to medicine, but also on a very biochemical cellular level. And we're going to talk then about some of the incredible modalities that we can use that are electrical in nature to benefit.
Is the volume can't go up
as well as are there people in the background? Sorry. Go ahead and mute you. As well as the effects of electromagnetic frequencies on our health. And so those are some of the many things that we will be diving into in our talk. And I'll probably be approaching the screen here to let users in as we start our talk mix. So I guess I first want to start off. Thank you so much for being here, Ty.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. And just a little bragging about the gratefulness I have for my relationship with Ty. He has been the longest standing practitioner as part of Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts, period. I've been here for 10 years and Ty has been here like 8.5, I think, right?
May will be number 9.
Number 9, we're almost there. So it's a really incredible thing. We've collaborated in supporting the health of our patients here for almost 9 years. And this is our second lecture together, but hopefully one of many to come. So happy to get to do this with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share my version of electricity and health with the community. And yeah, it's been in so many facets slow and so many facets very fast, this 9 years of us together. But this is my, so I think we can both agree this is some of our favorite time is sharing our passions and our modalities with our community at large.
Yeah, exactly. So this actually got inspired doing this topic because Ty utilizes a lot of electrotherapy in his practice, which she's going to talk all about. And it's just so impressive, the outcomes we get the huge fortune of witnessing with the collaborative work we do with patients mutually. And we're very blessed, and Ty is super gifted, and he exclusively works with patients of Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts through referral basis at this point. And so I just love, essentially, of his many skills, the electrotherapeutic skills, I believe, has a huge role to play in a lot of the patients I work with in their healing. And so I do not use as directive electrotherapeutic tools. And I'm really happy we have someone at the clinic who is super skilled and is going to, drop some knowledge bombs on y'all today about this toolbox. So yeah, here we go. Let's get into it. So I actually am going to kind of start off with background, and we're gonna tell a little story here that brings us up to that exciting discussion about electrotherapeutics and EMFs in our environment. And I think to start that story, we have to begin with the concept of electricity and the idea that we kind of take for granted that electricity is part of our lives, but really just the incredible permeation of electricity throughout the natural world too is something we don't often think about. And so it's really important when we talk about fundamental elements of nature to actually acknowledge that essentially everything that exists that is a physical substantive structure has, for the most part, an electrical charge. And what that means is that it has essentially, I mean, here we're brushing up on our physics, a positive and negative flow in which energy flows between different substances. And that basis of flow has to do with the charge of a substance. And then there are substances that conduct that charge more readily, and there are substances that conduct that charge less readily. But essentially, the thing to acknowledge about nature, just pure and simple, without any human alteration, is that everything has an electrical charge. Basically, and that a charge is flowing continuously in all of the matter that we interact with. And yes, this includes our bodies. And so some examples of that are very easy to appreciate is one example being when you see lightning strike and you essentially smell a ozone-like odor in the air following a lightning strike. That's literally the effects of electricity transforming molecules in our atmosphere that's generating that kind of sensation. Similarly, if we're talking about storms already, we can acknowledge that many people have experienced or know people or themselves have experienced awarenesses of electrical changes in the atmosphere and how that's felt in people's bodies. Their joints might ache, they might get a headache, they might have heightened sense of hearing, etc. And those are all, again, examples of how electricity and our environment interact with human perception. So we're really starting with this place of acknowledging that, hey, electricity is everywhere continuously in our environment, just as a matter of how nature is. But historically, the degree of electrical interaction with our human physiology, we could both argue, is much more subtle than what it is in our modern lives. Because really what began to happen, as most things human are, is that we've started to tinker with our environment in pretty intelligent ways that no other life form on Earth has ever done. And especially in the past few hundred years, that has the pace of that interaction with our environment has essentially become exponential. And one of the ways that we've really deeply interacted with our environment is in this realm of, the best way to put it is manipulating and harnessing electricity for human use. And, I don't want to kind of paint it as good or bad. I think that electricity has become more and more central to, I guess, being intertwined in our lives. And I think that is for good and bad, but nevertheless,
Howie,
understand this reality in depth as it applies to our health, then we're missing a really important part of the reality we live in. And that's, I think, our job today, is to talk about that, is how has this come about? What are the implications on our health? And how can we consciously do something about it / be educated as to how to use the best parts of electricity that exists in our world for our betterment, and how to protect ourselves against the harmful parts of electricity. So that's kind of our topic for the day. So getting into the history of electricity in terms of human harnessing of it, I think our story brings us back to the mid-1700s, and it brings us back to a time where, you're dealing with post-Enlightenment era in Western Europe, at least. And this is really where we're going to center our conversation, in terms of what I'll call the commercial use of electricity. But interestingly, in human health, we had actually already been harnessing electricity. And this is a little bit of a segue that we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but we're going to talk about a therapeutic modality briefly called acupuncture, which is actually something that's been around several thousands of years. And modern science has now validated that essentially the idea of this charged nature and this electrical nature of our world and the human body is one of the fundamental rationales for the efficacy of acupuncture, which is probably one of the oldest remaining traditions of medicine that exists still. And in brief, I won't go into it because Dr. David and I actually did a lecture on this last summer, which you can review, that was called Vital Energy. He spoke in depth about the mechanism of how acupuncture works and how essentially acupuncture is tapping into anciently known electrical fields in the body and activating those fields to function to create greater harmony and health. And indeed, the whole philosophical premise of acupuncture is the idea of the intersection of heaven and earth, which, funny enough, if you look at the electrical charge of heaven and earth, i.e. our atmosphere and our ground, you have a positively charged atmosphere and a negatively charged earth. And so we literally see the flow of this electricity and the coming together of it as fundamental to the whole philosophy of how Chinese medicine expresses itself to better people's health. So I wanted to say that actually our story doesn't start there in the 1750s or 1750 around when these Western European scientists. It actually, we got to give kudos to the practitioners of Chinese medicine who've been at it for thousands of years.
Yeah, definitely.
That being said, interesting to get into the Western world manifestation of electricity, which I'll start with this idea of materials were called, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody just so we don't get interrupted. These ideas of what is called a Leyden jar, and that's because of Leyden, Germany was the place these were invented. And essentially what was found is that when you used a certain cloth on glass, you could generate enough friction to actually elicit enough of a buildup of charge that when a human touched that jar, it would deliver a shock to them. And obviously at the time, just if you could only imagine, 300 plus years ago, how dramatic and surprising this phenomenon would be to someone who'd never experienced any form of electricity, human generated. And so this actually became very popularized, and, various businesses and, I'll call them practitioners, would offer electrical shocks as a very invigorating experience for the masses. And you would start to hear, like there's all this documented evidence of people forming these huge, circular chains and delivering shocks from a Leyden jar and spreading it through with everyone holding their hands. And of course, this was a very exciting discovery, which led to actually a lot of human experimentation with the effects of electricity. If you dig way back into this writing 250, 300 years ago, you start to see people document when they're using this a lot on a lot of people, what they start to notice. And, not all good things, which we'll get a lot more into here as we talk about the health effects of electricity on the human body. But I want to kind of fast forward a couple of decades to the end of the 1700s, and you have two really important scientists to kind of bring forward. And to me, it's a very big watershed point in the history of electricity and human use of electricity, and then human health. Because what you had at that time were two scientists, Luigi Galvani. So people have probably heard of the term galvanic circuits. That's the person who's responsible for that. And Alessandro Volta, which everyone knows the term volt. And that's because volt was associated with the discovery of what he invented, which is the electrical battery. And so what was so profound about this time is that when Alessandro Volta created the electrical battery, he essentially created a way to store electrical current. So remember how we talked about electricity is really essentially the flow of electrical charge from positive to negative. And that is like in its essence what electricity is. And when you can harness a way to store that charge so you can release it at your own discretion, you take at least human manipulation of electricity into a really valuable commodity for use in industry. And so that was a profound shifting point, also coinciding with many aspects of the Industrial Revolution that was going on at the time. And what you had with Alessandro Volta was being able to use electricity to transform the human experience. And a couple of the big ways that this happened is first in terms of transmission for communication. So you basically had telegraph wires where the medium of electricity through conducting circuits of metals would be able to transmit messages through wires conducting electricity. So we're talking about things like Morse code was the initial way that this was allowed to be done. And that could mean that you could string wires across cities or even across oceans and actually transmit signals to each other, which again, now we take for granted, but just imagine the profound shift and sense of accomplishment technologically to be able to communicate with each other from miles, if not hundreds of miles away, when before the furthest communication we could have is by how far our voices shouted to each other, or literally sail a ship or ride a horse to communicate something. So electricity has again profoundly changed our world for the better in many ways, and this is one of the ways is communication. So the Volta allowed that through the development of technology from storing charged electricity to communicate through telegraph wires. The other thing, though, that this stored charged electricity allowed was the ability to convert that electrical energy into mechanical energy to actually generate the motion of mechanical devices, essentially anything from a clock to a plow to an electrical car, and on and on and on. I mean, we know how many devices, including light bulbs, are powered through electricity. And so this idea of storing electrical charge and then applying it to generating energy that then turns something for mankind's industry has had a profound effect on our lives. Again, arguably in many ways for the better, from a pure standpoint of what the modern human is able to enjoy the comforts of and the use of via this set of inventions and scientific application of electricity to our environment. So there's a really important point to make in all of this, though, which is when this was done, we also simultaneously had all this research about the really concerning, worrisome things we were seeing in human health as we generated these electrical tools in industry to, improve our quality of life, quote unquote. And so, as we developed these modalities, starting with the Leyden jars, but then moving on to the telegraph wires and the transmission wires, we developed further technologies, radar. Then we're talking about other kinds of transmission towers, like cellular towers and 4G, 5G, all the way up to really modern day. And cell phones, computers, right? All of our electrical devices in our homes, we've seen first and foremost the people most closely tied to these industries as they develop really, really concerning manifestations of health. We're seeing severe episodes of anxiety, panic attacks, essentially mental breaks. Mental, emotional, really serious concerning findings, physiological concerning findings, heart palpitations, fatigue, many forms of skin conditions, severe circulatory dysregulations, pretty much any organ in the body showing evidence of really dysregulated physiology. And so that phenomenon, these folks working in these fields heavily exposed to electricity, as we generated and delivered these higher and higher, fields of electrical current in our lives, has led to some huge concerning, aspects to the health effects of electricity on the human body. And that's really where, coming back to Alessandro Volta, the decision was made as we developed these tools for industry that it was like, this is so good for industry, for making money, for advancing society, these commercial applications of electricity, that we chose to make a scientific, I guess, statement and theory that I think Ty and I would argue has come to be very incorrect, which is that electricity can pass through humans, but not interact with humans and not interact with our physiology for better or worse. I mean, that's essentially the premise that we've created with all these electrical technologies. And that's really in opposition to what Luigi Galvani was saying, which is, well, actually, the human body is highly electromagnetic in nature, and all of the structures in the human body behave in response to these charged natures of our tissues, and then therefore environmental electrical charge, and they are in this interlocked, relationship continuously. And that was the model and the theory that was largely thrown out by the scientific community, because if we didn't throw that model out, then we would have had to confront the real predicament that these advances in technology and how it's supporting industry and the ill effects on human health, how are we going to square that crux, that problem? So what was chosen was to ignore the effects on health of these electrical modalities and inventions and technologies we're evolving, and say they're not related. And when new patterns of epidemic disease emerged, especially with new technologies, where we saw increases in heart disease that had never been seen before, where we saw increases in the diagnosis of anxiety, or actually was termed initially neurasthenia, was not really a documented thing before electricity. And so now, please hear me when I say, am I saying that all anxiety or all heart disease is due to man-made electrical effects on the human body? No, I'm not. It's a very complex conversation, but observationally, we have these really profound moments where we can define these new technologies coming out and just the general increasing proliferation of electricity by human use in our environment, and how some of these health conditions have begun to manifest and spiral out of control. And what Ty and I want to do is get down to the kind of physiological level to maybe describe why this might be the case and what's going on here, really. And so the interesting thing is, you might think, hey, well, where's all the research if this is so true and so powerful? Why isn't all this research being documented? And that's an interesting answer, because there is actually quite a bit of research over many recent decades, but also over the very distant past. And it's really key that bifurcation that happened all the way back in the early 1800s in the Western world really essentially threw out the willingness and ability for Western scientists to confront this interactive nature of electricity and human health. And so a lot of the research you have, interestingly, comes out of Russia and China. There's mountains of research about largely the ill effects of human-generated electricity on human health. And we even have whole categories of diagnoses in their health literature that are essentially pinned down to electrical activity causing this disease or that disease. And so it's there, it's just not in our culture and in our kind of orbit of knowledge, because largely that science has been suppressed. Our argument would be in the interest of promoting industry and not kind of compromising what it ultimately is a huge conflict of interest there. So that's kind of really my big backdrop to say, how did we get here with electricity, and why is it not such a big topic in Western medical thought in why don't we talk about the effects of electricity on our health regularly with our physicians? Why is it, that it's just not central to not only the ill effects, but also how we can help health? Because it turns out, and we'll get into the physiology, that there's a lot of ways that electricity, when applied thoughtfully and appropriately to the human body, can be extraordinarily beneficial, which are some of the modalities Ty's got a lot of expertise in. So I want to dive in to, okay, if we could make these observations of electricity on human health in a broad, symptom related way, then how do we actually make sense of this down at the cellular level? And I think that's a real key launching point into then how do we apply electricity therapeutically if we can understand this at the cellular level.
Yeah, I think that's really the tenet of FSM. There is the differentiation between these unhealthy styles of electromagnetic fields that we get ourselves into in our daily life now at this point in time, as you so broadly pointed out. But then we got to flip the coin around on the other side and realize that there is a way for us to actually put our bodies in a healthy electromagnetic field that is going to be more simpatico with the type of energy that our cells make. And that's exactly what microcurrent is. It matches our body's electrical system and can interact with it, whether it's through the medium of the acupuncture meridians or, in the case of how I use it clinically, I have a pulse electromagnetic field generator. So we can put that around someone's body and run the device and support not only the electromagnetic field of it, but this is a specialized version that offers some frequencies or some vibrational pathways. So once we've made that connection to the body through the piezoelectric energy field, then we can start to charge our cells and improve vibratory patterns of tissues that have been causing, wellness issues. It's first was brought out in the mid-90s from Dr. Carolyn McMakin, and used in an application of supporting inflammatory patterns in the body, particularly with very difficult to deal with cases like fibromyalgia, chronic pain, kind of complex myofascial pain. There's a lot of verbose diagnosis on what that is, but essentially we've got electrical disruption of the body and we've got too much inflammation there. And using a modality like this can help reestablish our normal patterns of our cellular communication and bring back a sense of vibration that's going to restore us more to a state of wellness or homeostasis, as opposed to in this lower vibrating state or too elevated of a vibrational state that causes us some kind of symptom pathway, like you were mentioning with anxiety or whatever. Certainly my viewing lens as a pain management therapist it brings me to see that there are different types of nerve pain that ultimately after we've supported the body's electrical field, they tend to dissipate and last longer because it was that disturbance either from the external environment or a disturbance field on the skin from a scar, an old incision from an old injury. And that's where that crossover point of electrotherapy and acupuncture and my work comes in, is that we can analyze and help support that electrical integrity of the body with these type of therapies to reset, offset, whatever kind of scenario needs to happen there, the ill effects that this negative, the negative side of our electroionosphere is causing us symptomatically, wellness wise, in different ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think one thing to kind of put out there in this understanding is, we want to remember that our bodies are like upwards of 80% water. And so we'll get really into these granular electrical fields, like nerve conduction pathways, the whole neurological system in general. But we need to remember that the whole idea that, remember, I started at the beginning saying electricity moves and is all around us in our environment, but also in our body. And it really moves depending on how conductive the field is around it. And so just as human beings, one thing to realize with this concept of water is we are highly conductive. And so anything electrical that interacts with us, it's going to move through our tissues very vigorously and in a wide sweeping way. And so it's a powerful way to communicate with a human body. And arguably any living being is highly susceptible to electrical input, right? Because look at plants, right? They're also mostly made of water too. And any living being, a mushroom, a bug, a mammal, a human, are these essentially highly conductive vessels of tissues and cells. But the real thing that fascinates me is like what illuminates the intelligence of it, what actually makes it function. And I think that science, again, because of this suppression of electromagnetic fields as a big part of answering that question, has kind of like I'll say like boiled it down to very inanimate concepts like chemical interactions, right? That's how we think of the body, and science has taught us to think of the body, is these chemical interactions with molecules being converted by enzymes and building larger molecules and breaking down molecules. But it doesn't really talk about that model, which is our main scientific backbone of the illuminating energetic force that drives all of it. And
that's an excellent point, because that is where the whole premise of how we work with the body is using human cells as your semiconductors at this point in time. So definitely electrolytes and a hydrated body is what I need to be able to have the best therapeutic benefit from what we're doing. And at that point in time, it holds that resonance a little bit longer as well. So, we learn when we're pretty young that water is a great conductor of electricity and whatnot, and, go inside when the lightning happens, whatever. But when you think about it on this other level here, we can hold the cellular charge, and that is the way that it relates, the microcurrent relates to the body as well, as through a very scientific phrase called the voltage gated ion channels. But essentially the one that we know the most, and the one that's the most relevant in my industry, is the sodium potassium pump for your muscle spindles. If you don't have that correct gradient of sodium and potassium, you're going to experience cellular dehydration. You're going to experience muscle cramps. There isn't the electrical signaling of the body to communicate what it needs to. So this is right. It's a key element of restoring that, is having a hydrated field. So
and so we think about like how supplements or how drugs interact with us, and that's much of our like toolbox in modern medicine. And really the way that those are being thought of is that, oh, okay, well, we're going to give this substance that interacts with this chemical composition and builds or break down like different tissues in our body to function differently. But what we forget when we just oversimplify it that way is that actually it's the electrical field conduction and the energy generated from that, and that like orchestrates those chemical reactions, that is what makes it all possible. And unfortunately, we have a lot of dysregulation in that regard. I mean, Ty mentioned just now hydration. If we're not hydrated with appropriate electrolytes, that electrical system is not going to function well.
Right.
But also what he said, all of these electrical field distortions will actually shut down that essentially communication and energy generating apparatus that is our bodies. That's an amazingly elegant mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's most helpful with people who do have these, absorption issues with things. I mean, that's a common thing I know you deal with in your practice, is nutrient malabsorption. Well, this is a very neat and therapeutic way to actually help these bodies move forward in lieu of supplementation. So you really, at that point in time, when you have somebody who's in that regressed state, you must start with their electrical system. And that goes in, tenets with other kind of pain management therapies that I've worked with. Old German German medicine, where you must remove your scar interference fields if you're going to maintain wellness. So the integrity of the electrical system, in a certain right, you could argue is the substrate for everything else being able to be conducted appropriately, and the absorption there, so that the communication pathway is there.
Yeah, and I think what Ty's hitting on that is, again, kind of flies in the face of what we have been told with Western science is the fundamental operation at a very like small level in the body, is this difference between how modern Western medicine, Western science describes electrical conduction and what we actually understand it to be in our experience with it, and these other trains and schools of thought, which is, we think of the cell as this, formulation biochemically of molecules and this bag of fluid that has some electrons buzzing around it, and that these electrons can kind of interact with the cells immediately adjacent to it, and that's kind of the extent of electrical communication. But there's actually so much more, kind of, I guess, the way to make a metaphor of it is like, you almost want to call them like highways of communication, and the science that best like represents this is this idea of quantum physics, that many particles and information can be many places at once. And so electricity is beautiful in that regard, because its transmission speed and ability is, basically unmeasurable in how fast it happens. And it's all, when it's communicating, it's like everything is affecting everything. In other words, that there's this feedback loop that's instantaneous in this communication. And so it's so much more than just one cell talking to the next electrically. It's actually happening on this much vaster sphere. And that's why our modern description of, the neuron is kind of like this oversimplified model that, the neurological system, as they say, like you have this activation of sodium potassium channels that travels down a neuron, and then it has a synapse where it secretes chemicals across to the next neuron, and then it travels down the next neuron. Whereas actually in this other quantum physics model, we actually focus much more on the myelin sheaths that envelop the neurons. And it turns out that, guess what? The piezoelectric energy of these myelin sheaths are profoundly complex and robust. We consider them essentially semiconductors in the body, and that the transmission of these electrical impulses and fields is vastly more complex than this boiled down neuron kind of dialogue that we've had with electricity.
Yeah, and I think the way that I would speak that in FSM would be the idea that we can communicate with all these cells in the body, kind of like you would use your fob to open up your car, rather than have to put a physical key in. The neuron model is more like the physical key there, right? Where this myelin model of this superconductive highway that can send signals through different spaces and times, that's more precise in my experience with how I've seen it applied to people in different cases. But it's having to unlearn that idea or rethink that idea critically is where a lot of this conversation has been had.
Yeah, totally. And so we're kind of the canaries in the coal mine here, so to speak, about this in the Western medical world, but we obviously believe very passionately about its truth, and have seen the clinical benefits. And I think that could kind of be, I would love to hear a little, segue in that regard, is, okay, we're really zoomed in on the like kind of super mechanical, philosophical, like nitty gritty science of the concept we're talking about. But maybe like, let's zoom it back out and say, apply, give a little practical understanding of some of this toolbox you have and how you've learned to use it to say, well, how does this interact for the better with the human body and human medical disturbance? And, some of the ways you see this most advantageous and kind of what we are afflicted with in, human health.
Yeah, absolutely. You gave a little bit of that sort of historical piece there, where a lot of the research came from other places besides the United States, Russia, China, and that sort of thing. The first incarnation of frequency specific microcurrent actually came from an Australian naturopath that Dr. Carroll had met back in the early 1990s, and he had a handmade machine from the 1920s that actually was pulling radio frequencies out of the ether here before, in our country, the FCC owned that. They could use that as a tap-in point. So Dr. Carroll and her colleague, Dr. George, kind of had to go back to the drawing board, use the known wisdom of microcurrent already, which had been employed in Chinese medicine and something that's known as Russian stim in the pain management world. And then kind of make it something different and unique using Dr. Van Gelder's frequencies that he gave to the team. So the machine that they came up with, the first one was an analog interface machine that was able to produce 2 different channels of frequencies along with the microcurrent conduction. So we've kind of got a couple of things happening here when we're discussing what frequency specific microcurrent is. It's a singular modality, but you're sort of weaving in a couple of things here. You've got the knowledge of microcurrent, which is that cellular energy ATP increase. And the research on that, at a milliamp or a millionth of an amp is showing that we can charge your cells by 500% and get that energy increase. There's collagen, elastin, and circulatory benefit to that. So that's just the microcurrent's interaction with the body there. And then on top of it, the specialized type of devices that they've created allow these 2 different channels of frequencies. And the studies that were approved for our usage involve putting in frequencies known to decrease inflammation for a condition, and then a tissue channel, which helps kind of guide the vibrational pathways to the right place where we want to work. And in this case, it was the spinal cord. And the inflammatory signal that the spinal cord puts off is known as substance P, and that is something that is measurable in blood work. And so what they did here to try to substantiate it was to take some pre-therapy blood work, ran the therapeutic on the individual, and then did a post-therapeutic blood work and saw some drastic decreases in things. So they continued to work with that model. And it kind of came, Dr. Carroll's a chiropractor, Dr. George is a chiropractor. So it was kind of couched in the United States as more of a pain management tool. And that then once it was approved for use, we could work on nerve pain. And Dr. Carroll, by the late 1990s, was publishing papers that have made it to PubMed level studies, proving that it was, with a p-value, which is the statistical significance of something that we've done, basically proving that it's beyond a reasonable doubt that it could have been anything other than this microcurrent intervention that is supporting the inflammatory pathways in the body. As I mentioned, we move a lot of electrical signals with the sodium potassium, looking at electrolytes to support it. So as a medical massage therapist, I'm dealing with a lot of different things, from whiplash injuries, surgeries, old things that happened many years ago before these type of modalities were available, but they're still kind of having some issues with it. So it's the combination of using the manual therapy and using the assistance of the microcurrent is where I've just seen my best benefits. 20 years of clinical practice and 16 of them with the microcurrent. I wouldn't want to do it any other way at this point in time. There are some wonderful studies that have been published about other ways to support the viscera of the body, the lymphatic system, the brain. It's used in military applications for helping with kind of fight or flight dysregulation, post-traumatic stress. So, for me, I've got my vein that I work in with helping people with different sources of their pain and different tissues and scar tissue pathways that are holding their spine up from being able to put a correct electrical signal into the organ that system feeds from whatever vertebral level. So it's kind of going through and supporting the nervous system and supporting the tissues that are having the dysfunction there, and the benefit of the inflammation. Even a very intriguing study on working with some shingles infections and that viral nerve pain, and mediated that way. We can kind of shut down that process of the body and just kind of bring that homeostasis back much more quickly than traditional methods, or when you have a sticky case with somebody who can't absorb one way or the other. So it's a very multifaceted way to approach the body. It is probably my most powerful tool, and the one that I've had the longest in this microcurrent electrotherapy realm. Luckily, there have been some other great incarnations along the way that were spurred on by this idea of human cells as semiconductors. So there's another company named Avasia who I use devices on, and they're muscle stimulators. They have some wonderful non-narcotic pain management relief, just like the FSM does. And, red light therapy using an external application of something. And the red light crossover isn't necessarily in the frequencies, but it's in that cell energy communication pathway. You're getting that ATP. So all of these creative ways to externally apply light or electricity and change that deeper physiological effect of things. And you get to be the person who sees the difference in the markers in the lab, the benchmarks in the labs, and the presentation of the person once we've kind of done some of those corrections there.
Yeah, that's so beautiful to just hear. I mean, I've never quite actually heard you synthesize, fundamentally what you're doing with people quite so elegantly. So I'm glad it's recorded and people get to hear it. I mean, my kind of summarized version of what you said is that essentially there's two profound ways that these therapeutic modalities work with your patients. One is to re-enliven and generate energy, in the cell, in the tissue, in the organ, all expanding all the way up to the entire body by essentially working with these charged fields that are inherent to how the human body, experiences energy to exist. And then on the other level, this other layer of electrical fields essentially needing to be flowing appropriately and communicating appropriately in order for there to be health. Or put another way, when there is disease, if you boil the theory down, that the electrical field is distorted and dysregulated, and the therapeutic need is to restore the flow to the electrical field, which these FSM Avasia devices essentially have the capacity with a skilled practitioner to tune into where the field is distorted with a skilled practitioner, and then what frequencies are needed to restore that field.
Absolutely. And I use that word frequently. I call my work restorative when we're talking about this. And what I love about, these, even dial down a little bit more to that, you very well encapsulated what I was hoping you to get there. But with these special devices that we have, now they've created them, this one particular iteration is called a custom care. So now I can take something where someone can bring in an MRI result of a spinal, something in the hip or knee or whatever, and I can take a look at the tissue status that the radiologist has put out there on that MRI, and then I can in turn translate that into frequencies as kind of a foreign language for looking at conditions in different tissues. That way I know that I'm giving a customized a treatment to anybody who comes in, and we can take, that's where I get to, I love the collaborative point here with you. You can give me your version of where they need support. I can look at the imaging report on the structural side of things, and we can actually create these protocols that are specifically tailored to the individual, which is the other fun part of it. Is I get to not only apply the units, but I get to be the programmer as well. The baseline tech is there, and then I get to manipulate how it enters the body. A little back channel on that. It comes in through a squared sine wave into the body, and we can manipulate how that comes into the body when we're working on something. When we've got an acute injury, we're gonna have a very low wave because we want a soft and gentle approach of this electrical entry into the body. when I'm cutting through scar tissue, we need to create that amplitude increase. So we're coming in and we're kind of thinking about chopping this scar tissue up and remodeling it. It needs a little more energetic there. So that's where, you know, I stepped into just learning about the technology in the first couple of years, and then adding this other facet of it on has really been able to help me expand and become very focal in my you know, finding the results that we're looking for clinically here to be able to have that opportunity. So it's kind of a very open-ended piece there. When you've got it, we can go lots of different directions.
And I think I haven't spoken about my clinical applications and passions today because I don't actually work with electricity as directly as Ty, but part of our joy of what we get to do is it's continuously pioneering and it's always learning, and you're always building upon your experience and, you know, this expansive toolbox that just keep, you know, learning more about how to apply it. And there's no standard of care. There's no, you know, way it's supposed to be done. It's so complex. And
it's so unique to the individual, which is just, that's why I've enjoyed it so much. There's no cookie cutter involved. But it's, you know, the vibrational work is our sort of, the common mountaintop we stand on, you know, you as a homeopath, you know, and a vibrational medicine, I understand that vibrational pathway and how you can affect that, you know, very, very deeply. And that's why it's, you know, it's easy to see, for you to see the need or the caliber of support that my work could offer in an electrophysical, you know, kind of area. But yeah, now we've got this in professional sports of every single level, a rehabilitative tool. I mean, beyond just what I'm doing clinically here, we've got so many different applications. It has been widely accepted and seen as a very regenerative therapy for anybody who's an elite level athlete or needs elite level rehabilitation.
Yeah, which is usually how it starts, is in a high money circled, you know, high kind of, you know, stakes, you know, performance based, a lot of these modalities. But here's Ty doing it at Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts for our community. And, you know, I should brag a little bit about you. You were one of 2 people, I think, in the entire, you know, metro region who has expertise in this modality.
I've met some wonderful practitioners throughout the country, but you know, me kind of planting my flag out here is I'm a little bit of a standalone. You know, I have a couple other colleagues in across the state line in Washington there, but yeah, that's the being able to have some extensive training, and I began it many years ago, and Dr. Carroll was still teaching the seminars herself. And kind of I feel like I really got a ground level entry on how to apply it, and got to work with some people who really had a deep understanding of it, and the clinical application, and being able to serve and benefit my community by using it has been a fantastic space for me.
We're blessed to have it. And so I guess, you know, on a practical level for our Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts community, a lot of our patients of our doctor team, you know, knowing that Ty's here is absolutely part of our team. In fact, the oldest member of our team, if we talk about a team of practitioners. And so this is an opportunity just to really have this out there for our community. Hey, this tool might really apply, and we want to think about health in an electrochemical way, not just a chemical way. And I think that is the fundamental dialogue of this conversation today, is we are very electrical in nature as human beings, and there is many, almost infinite fields of electricity interacting with our body, both in the architecture of our body itself and how it's intelligently designed, as well as our environment. And here's Ty with a therapeutic tool to better the functioning of that electrical communication signaling and physiology. So we don't want to make electricity the bad guy. We just want to illustrate the nuance of its effect on our health and some of the ways we can harness it for good for health purposes.
Yeah, and just it's a look on the other side of the coin there, because all those things that you were talking about, of the lack of attention paid to it. But the body of practitioners that I work with has kind of taken some of those old tenets and brought a modern approach to them that makes it very functional. And that's what children can benefit from it. I treat my own children with these modalities and other things like that. So there's no there's no, not a lot of constraints to using it and improving your health.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm excited the community gets to learn more about it. And I will transition to our closing here, or close to our closing, which is to really like come back to kind of most of the buildup of the lecture before Ty really dove into this toolbox therapeutically with electricity to say, hey, there's this huge history, and it's almost like a worsening and worsening horror story as to how electricity has harmed our health and the health of the world in many ways. And we have, I mean, I'm not a big study citer. That's kind of, but we have like a litany of studies. And by the way, I should mention this, I probably should have at the beginning, but for all y'all who really want to dive into this story and have a way more elegant and thoughtful and long-winded kind of just learning about this story, where a lot of my lecture material and kind of history buildup was generated is a book called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg. So Invisible Rainbow, yeah, by Arthur Furstenberg. And he was trained as a physician, but also was one of those highly sensitive individuals to electricity, which is about 10% of our population. And so his health personally has been affected greatly. So he put his scientific, and life dedication to this understanding of the story of electricity. And he wrote an amazing book. I actually kind of re-listened to it in preparation for this talk and was re-inspired and, re-edified about this story. And so really, if you want to go deeper, I highly recommend The Invisible Rainbow. And then also, with all of these ill effects and the fact that we can't take, our computers and our cell phones away, and we can't take the wires I see outside of my windows running over our building and the wires in the walls of our building and the atmosphere and the radar and the cell phone towers and on and on and on. I mean, it gets kind of depressing if you start to layer the amount of frequencies, electromagnetic frequencies that are, essentially interfacing with our electrical fields in our body. And again, not in an intelligent therapeutic way, but in a totally haphazard way that by design our society has chosen to ignore, to say, well, this is part of the epidemic of chronic modern disease. I mean, and that book, The Invisible Rainbow, argues that a huge number of our modern diseases are at least in part, if not largely, attributable to these, electromagnetic fields, EMF, that is in our environment. And so, we also don't want to leave this lecture without acknowledging, well, this is a big problem. So on one hand, we have this therapeutic use of electricity. We have a skilled practitioner in our clinic who offers one of the modalities that works incredibly. But on the other hand, we have this day in, day out inundation with these EMFs. And what is there a way we can navigate and address that? And, I think we want to leave you with some really practical things to acknowledge that can be done. So I don't know, Ty, if you want to kind of take a jump at some of the core thoughts you have and guide people or personally use.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic because like you're saying, we're inundated in it whether we want to or not. Some of my colleagues I've worked with refer to it as electrosmog. It's invisible, but there it is. So there's a lot of different things that are supportive to it. The idea of earthing is really key to that. It's about as close as you can get to the original sort of microcurrent device. So we doing a lot of grounding and earthing type of things is really great for that. There are some specialized forms of phototherapy that support the sort of EMF sensitivity. I'm sure you have some supplementation that is supportive to that kind of piece there. But for me, there's a group of people that I work with that know that they just need to come in for a little electro tune-up every now and then, or they made the decision to get a device for their family so they can use it when they need to, when these things are kind of a little more elevated. So it's about finding these places where you're a little more connected to nature. Swimming, when we get to do it, it's great. It's immersing yourself in a different space to negate those effects. You know, microcurrent is something that can be done in the comfort of your own home or at a clinical level. But yeah, it's something that you have to remind your body of this resonance and vibrational pattern to hold that space, because more than not, we're having it pulled us the opposite way, you know, and we have to bring it back a little bit. So,
and I think that so I'm gonna like kind of summarize what you said, like, you know, earthing, and by the way, grounding and earthing, this literally, rubber is not a conductor. So when you have shoes on, you're not grounding yourself, right? Because we wear rubber soled shoes. We talked about all things have charge in nature, but some of them are much more conductive than others. Rubber is not conductive at all. And so when we're wearing our shoes, we're not actually getting grounded. When we're on buildings with carpet that has plastics, and again, a lot of petrochemicals, we're not connecting to the core charge of the earth that is ultimately very calming and aligning to our electrical fields. And so that's specifically, earthing means, you know, barefooted, walking on the ground, not insulated by shoes or carpets, etc. Now, there's ways to get around this. You can get earthing pads, grounding mats, where you can ground them into the earth. And these are online and readily available, and you can Google them and find them. So there are tools to engage this. And again, those electrically sensitive people are going to benefit disproportionately to a tool like that. I think Ty mentioned another thing that's really key, which is, you know, getting out in nature. And so not just earth when you can, but also do some retreating, you know, get out, go camping, go get on a hike, you know, get away from a lot of the most, you know, obvious, flagrant electrical fields that are distorting your health, and have, you know, periods of retreat or moments of retreat, you know, all the ways that you can do that. I mean, that is a very practical effort we can all make. And, you know, touching on the therapeutic benefits of water, it's just, you know, that's a hugely conductive, grounded medium for our electrical fields. So on the positive side of ways you can engage, and Ty also mentioned home units of the stuff he does, which is incredible too, that if this really inspires you, you can take that level of investment with Ty and get something like that. On the flip side of the coin, it's like, how do we reduce our exposure, right? Well, one of them is retreats, of course, but I think we got to just shut our stuff off that we can shut off, right? The power wires over our heads, we can't shut off. The 5G towers, we can't shut off. You know, all the frequencies emitted in our atmosphere, we can't shut off. Are the buildings we're in, we can't de-electrify them. But, you know, we can shut off our Wi-Fi routers at night. We can keep our cell phones out of our bedrooms, which are huge EMF emitters. You know, we can essentially actually get cages and clothing materials that will block a lot of the EMF energies. So, you know, this is a whole field, thankfully, that's emerging to support this, but also just practical things of the things you can control to reduce activity, you know, do them, turn all the smart everythings off, which are electromagnetic field emitters in your homes, or don't have them in the first place, you know. So I think we have to just, you know, talk prevention and this concept in naturopathic medicine, which is remove obstacles to cure, is what can we do to reduce our exposure to, versus what can we do to realign our fields. So we're kind of saying both here.
Yeah, I think that's really key. You know, I mean, remit where you can and make those sort of microcosm changes that are going to give you the best opportunity. But yeah, it's nice to see these other things like the clothing types and blankets and mats that kind of help us get a little bit more opportunity for that restorative, you know, sleep and in general, just overall bodily restoration. By blocking a negative electricity field. That's the story.
Yeah, and I can end on a very personal touch from my own part of this lecture, which is I grew up on some acreage and, you know, out in nature. I think there's a lot to it besides the electromagnetic field component, but it is deeply calming to me. And that's, you know, we highlighted anxiety being one of the main, you know, agitated neurological system, which again, in Eastern countries like Russia and China, they call this electrical illness, anxiety. And I resonate with that because I can experience the calm that I experience when I go out into nature and remove a huge degree of those electrical fields that are pummeling my body. That one of the effects is I feel more peaceful. And
Yeah.
so it is like deeply powerful as a truth in my life that I'm reminded of every day, or at least the opportunities I'm really diligent about. And I use my hot tub every day, and these kind of tools that are so grounding for me when I talk to my patients about what grounds me, and because I'm asking them all to do it, I realize that it's electrically grounded activities, and removing myself from highly electrically stimulated environments. So I'd really invite everybody who's, listening to this lecture inspired by that on a very simple level to just, bring consciousness and intention to efforts and opportunities to do that and see how it affects you. Yeah. So that's my wrap. I think we're a little over on time. Thank you so much, Ty, for
thank you
being
so much for
here.
having me. It's an exciting topic, and I think we have plenty to talk about here. So I'm happy to have it, and be a fountain of information for anybody else that can here.
Yeah, so we look forward to hearing from you all about your questions and insights from this talk. And thanks for attending. All right, have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.